Okay, I'll repeat that. I was on mute before, so it's close enough to 3:10. We're going to get started for our last INRC seminar for the 2022-2023 academic calendar, I guess. Finals week here at Iowa State University. And this month, we're talking all things cover crops. And I think it's kind of cool. We're going to go from the grazing or use of those cover crops to understanding how cover crops might impact corn for the subsequent corn crop. So we're going to start with Erika Woolfolk, that is a ISU Extension beef specialist in Southwest Iowa, and the Beef Center has had a project on looking at grazing cover crops. And then we'll have Dr. Alison Robertson talk about, I'll read her title in a second because I think I'll forget it. I guess that's it for those in the room. Make sure you sign your name. You get in the drawing for a coffee mug. Mitch, you already have one, I know, at least. So you use it every day. All right. So that's come in the future to get in that drawing. With that, I will turn it over to Erika. Let me just a second here. There we go. I'm going to hide the thumbnail view so folks in the room, hopefully everybody can still see the screen. Okay, I'll check on my computer. And Erika, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you.
So the floor is virtual on.
Awesome. Thank you. I am the beef specialist for Southwest Iowa, and I also want to put in a plug for Dan Loy. He is the director of the beef team in the back of the room here, but he was a big part of this project. And then also to Rebecca Vivto would be our Southeast Iowa field agronomist, and she was a big part of a lot of this research I'm going to talk about as well. And of course, there's others too on our beef and agronomy extension team that played a part, but those were the two main two I wanted to make sure I give a plug to. All right, so just to kind of set the stage here and get us started, I want to focus on some of the benefits of using annual forages and cover crops in the grazing aspect, but also integrating that into our row crop situation. So probably nothing new here. Obviously, cover crops have been around enough that we started to really capitalize on some of these benefits. But today, I primarily want to focus on those on the bottom. From a grazing perspective, cover crops are really nice because they provide some of that flexibility for the farm enterprise. Great opportunity to extend the grazing season if Mother Nature works in our favor there. We'll talk a little bit about forage quality today, but in general, cover crops tend to be very high and above what our cattle need. So really a great resource for us to have. And then of course, too, if we are able to extend that grazing season, it's a good opportunity to reduce some of those feed costs and labor associated with the cow herd from that perspective. I'm a very visual person, so I like to kind of use this slide here to show how cover crops can fit into the cow herd perspective or the cattle industry. So the top line there would be our cool season pastures. In Iowa, that's our primary forage base that we have available. So those boxes kind of indicate the time of year when those forages are most available for the cow herd to be grazing. Corn stalks, another great opportunity for us to capitalize on that forage from a beef cattle perspective, but obviously we're just looking at after grain harvest there, that those are really beneficial. And so when we start to add in some cool season annual forages, there's some opportunity to fill some gaps that we might not have elsewhere. So a really good opportunity to go to cover crops, to graze prior to our pastures, and then also too in the winter months, there's an opportunity to graze as well. And cover crops fit really well with corn stalks to balance the diet for those cattle and extend that grazing season in the winter months. We won't focus on it today, but we have done some research as well with warm season annuals that kind of fill in that summer slump, kind of that July, August. Our cool season pastures are pretty unproductive. Having warm seasons provide an opportunity to add in some of those grazing opportunities throughout those summer months. Jumping right into some of our research that we've done. So we started this as a project looking at multiple years. We knew that cover crops were something new. really kind of taking off from a grazing perspective and an interest there. And so we wanted to have multiple years of data that was available. And Iowa State, we had the opportunity, several outlying research farms that have cattle. And so we were actually on 3 different farms for Iowa State. So the Ali would be up in Buena Vista County, kind of northwest Iowa. The Western Farm over in Monona County in Western Iowa, kind of the Lost Hills area. And then down at the ISU McNay Research Farm. So this would be Lucas County, Southern Iowa. And this is primarily where the Iowa State research cow herd is. And then we were using stocker cattle to graze at both McNay and then at the Ali and Western farms. Key takeaway here is the variation. So all of these cover crops would have been fall seeded, cereal rye, and of course, just based off of the traditional farms, corn bean rotation is how we were following with the cereal rye that was there. We did have a couple cases that are noted kind of by the asterisks there at the McNay farms that were focused, or that the rye yield seems to be a little bit higher, and that's because we were behind corn silage. So having a cow herd there, corn silage is a great opportunity to take it off and then get that cover crop drilled a little bit earlier from that perspective. So 2018, the other farms, Ali and Western, didn't have anything there that was worth sampling. McNay was a little bit disappointing depending on their field, but that rye behind the corn silage looked really great in the spring when we got that yield potential that was there. Very nice yield that we saw following that one. So bottom line there kind of shows, yes, we have variation from year to year. Lots of things are impacting that. Our planting date, so if we were behind corn or beans, was typically a big driving factor. And then of course, Mother Nature played a role as well. All right, very busy slide here, and I apologize. But I think it kind of shows some of the variation and demonstrates some of the things that we kind of saw in this study and we would expect our producers out in the field to see as well. So I'm going to highlight the top box there. So this is all data just from the McNay farm. I mentioned we had 3 different fields that we were using as part of this study. So I'm just going to highlight that field B up there at top and kind of talk through that. And then you guys can look down through those lower slides there and look at some of that data as well. Grazing days. Number 1 question we get from our producers that are interested in this is, what can I expect for spring grazing days? And this study was a great indication of showing the variability that's there. So you can see in that first field that's highlighted, we ranged anywhere from no grazing, which was actually, that particular field was a herbicide issue. That's why we didn't graze it. But we have other fields that we had some growth there that we didn't have enough to really worry about grazing, all the way up to 42 days of grazing that we had on some corn silage, on some cereal rye that was following corn silage. So we had kind of some of that yield boost there. Dates for our turnout that our cattle went out and they were also removed off the cover crop are listed there. Just kind of an FYI to give you an idea of what we were dealing with in terms of grazing. Our forage yield, that is on a dry matter basis. So with beef cattle, it's kind of our primary interest is dry matter versus as fed basis. And then of course we have listed there our stocking rate. So we have an animal unit per acre. Anybody familiar with the term animal unit in the room? About a 1,000-pound cow. And we don't have much for 1,000-pound cows anymore. So we put it on the animal unit per acre to kind of help standardize from that perspective. So with some of these fields, we were using cow-calf pairs. McNay has a spring calving herd that was grazing the cover crops. But then we did have some instances too where we were using those stocker cattle that were either a replacement female or growing calves that were grazing it as well. So that column on the far right there, we don't have any in this particular study or field, excuse me, but we did across the study where we were measuring average daily gain or performance while grazing. And so you can see those down there in field C and D. We did have some of those opportunities for those stocker cattle to graze, and we have the average daily gain that's shown. Just to kind of maybe clear it up and summarize this a little bit better. On average with this study, including the yields that we did not graze due to low yields, we averaged about 19 grazing days in the spring across the 5 years of this study. Our forage yields were somewhere in the around that 16,000 pounds of dry matter per acre that was available for grazing. Our stocking rate was just shy of 2 of those animal units per acre. And then our average daily gain for the study was about 1.8 while those calves were grazing. So there is some potential there. Obviously, Mother Nature kind of dictates when we have that available for us to graze or not. Change gears here a little bit and focus on another project that was funded by the Nutrient Research Center here that was focused on doing some forage plot work at some of our outlying research farms. So our previous research I talked about, we had used cereal rye was our standard cover crop that we had. And it's kind of the gold standard for cover crops. So we've had a lot of cattlemen that have asked us, is it really the right forage to be using when we're grazing? And so this is kind of where this study came from. Barley was a cover crop that we've gotten a lot of interest on. Anybody ever used barley as a forage resource before? I would not recommend it. The question came from our producers wondering, specifically in southern Iowa, if we got a mild winter, how would it overwinter? What was it like? And we'll show some pictures that it did not do very well, so I would not recommend it from that standpoint. Also had some varieties of a hard red winter wheat and a forage wheat. Forage wheat has been bred for a little bit softer of a leaf, has more forage production than our hard red winter wheat typically would. We looked at triticale, which was kind of the hybrid option between the winter wheat.
No.
Best of both worlds.
No.
And then hybrid rye was one that we added in the last 2 years to look at. Had some questions from producers there. And over these plots, we also overlaid our treatment of nitrogen as fertilizer, either at 0 or 50 pounds, to try to show producers the value of when we're using cover crops for grazing to get the extra forage. We have a picture here from the Armstrong Research Farm. This is the day of sampling. I'll click the button here. It'll kind of overlay our treatments. And I mentioned I would not recommend barley. Those 2 plots in the back where things look pretty bare. That's kind of how it turned out for us. Not a lot of germination that was happening there. One visual I like to point out here is our nitrogen treatments really kind of pop up. We have a brighter green forage than some of those that did not have the added nitrogen. So the forage wheat there in the center and the back is a little bit lighter green colored. That plot did not have nitrogen applied. So it becomes kind of a visual there to see the nitrogen benefits. This is just looking at our species, our tons per acre. Again, we're on a dry matter basis. We're right in that ballpark between that 1 and 2 acres, or 2 tons, excuse me, of forage that was available per acre. So it is on a dry matter basis. We can see that nice visual response of having that nitrogen applied, kind of where we would expect it to be in terms of planting. So these forages, I should have mentioned, were seeded in the fall. We were actually in a rotation between cool season and warm season, but one of our goals was to be intentional, trying to target that early October seeding date with our cool seasons, so it'd still be applicable behind the row crop scenario. At the Armstrong Research Farm in the Neely Canyon in Southwest Iowa, based off of forage harvesting limitations, we were harvesting on everything at the same day. So when we were targeting kind of the boot stage for harvest of those cover crops, and we're doing that typically about this time of year is when it would end up being for harvest. At McNay, they have a little bit different setup in that research farm. And so they actually harvested it when each species was reaching that target boot stage. So as we would expect, rye was the first that was ready for harvest. Barley, they had a little bit better success at the McNay farm than we did at the other 2 research farms. And so it was harvested the same time as rye was, but really just not much productivity that was there regardless of our farm. About a following week later was when that triticale was ready. And then our last 2 species that were ready for harvest would be our forage varieties of those forage wheat and the hard red winter wheat. And so we like to use this as a nice visual for our producers to think about when those forages are ready for harvest. So if we have a producer that's maybe really wants to hone in on grazing cover crops in the spring, they're okay if they plant their corn a little bit later. That forage wheat and hardwood winter wheat, those might be better options for them. If we have a producer who is really wants to get corn in the ground by May 1st, rye is probably a better option for them to stick with in terms of getting that forage harvested off so they can meet that planting date that they're after. This is the slide showing our crude protein and the total digestible nutrients or the energy levels of those cover crops. And so you can see some of the variation here. The number one thing that sticks out is our barley. And so if you think back to our plots, we didn't have a whole lot that was there. And what was there was very vegetative. So that's kind of the disclaimer that's going on there, why it looks so much better than others. Overlay here, kind of our nutrient quality of our cool season pastures this time of year. So it's a good comparison to see. So our cover crops, not only are they much more readily available than our cool season pastures are at this time of year, but they're a lot higher quality too. So spring calving herds right now is a high nutrient requirement on those females. And so this is a nice opportunity to add in some cover crops to meet some of those nutrient requirements and also give our cool season pastures a bit of a break, kind of a jump start for the year. All right, I have just a few minutes left here. My next couple of slides are some things that were kind of some potential grazing issues that we ran into in this studies that we've done, but also heard from producers as well. So the first thing is moisture content. We often get the question from our producers if our forage crop that we're dealing with is about 80% moisture, 20% dry matter, can she physically eat enough? So a mature cow, maybe she can eat that much pounds of forage, but our growing cattle definitely cannot. So we always advocate to use some type of a supplement or provide dry hay, something to help balance those females out from that standpoint. Nitrate and sulfur toxicity, not something that's super common by any means from grazing cover crops, but it is something that we occasionally run into. So we just want to make our producers aware of that. For sake of time, I'm going to skip over some of my management comments down there. Grass tetany is another one. I've actually just gotten a call this week from a producer who thinks that they ran into some grass tetany issues while grazing cover crops. So that's something else to be aware of. All right, soil compaction. Fencing and water limitations and the concern of soil compaction tend to be the two biggest things that limit producers from grazing cover crops, from utilizing cover crop perspective. And so this is a slide that Rebecca Vivicello had put together, basically looking at some of that bulk density and that compaction risk. And so with the study that I talked about with the McNay farm, up first, we did measure some of that bulk density. And this is the data that's summarized from those 3 McNay farms. And in general, the higher the bulk density number, the greater the risk of that soil compaction. And so with this study, we were measuring in the fall before that cover crop was seeded. So that's that first line. We had a treatment on each of our fields that had no cover crop that was there. And then of course we had a cover crop that was growing, but we did not graze it. And then we had the main focus, our cover crop that we had grazed. So kind of like you would expect here, statistically, there was no difference in our bulk density numbers, but as that cover crop was growing, we saw a benefit to that bulk density being decreased, so less compaction. But when we came back and grazed it, we did see a bit of an increase in that compaction risk. But again, not statistically different, wasn't different from what our fall baseline was. So we did have a benefit from having those cover crops growing, but grazing it did set us back a little bit, but not enough that we would notice it. Our producers, when we have this question from them, we often tell them to manage it how they would grazing corn stalks, try to avoid some of that. So yes, we're creating some of that surface roughness, but we're not creating issues for planting into. From a grazing perspective, adding in some cover crops to graze as a priority is going to take some alterations on the row crop side to make it really work. We might have to look at shorter season varieties of corn or beans to make that happen. Pesticide label restrictions is a big obstacle. And so Rebecca has this resource here that she always recommends to producers to look at to check those labels before we go in and plant that cover crop. Of course, water and fencing are limitations. And then we also talked a little bit earlier about that offering some dry matter to complement those wet species of our forages that we're often dealing with in the spring. Typically recommend starting to graze when that cover crop is about 6 inches. We talk about the pluck test as a great test for that. Basically, if you grab a hold of that plant about 1 inch or 2 off of the ground, if you pull on it and it snaps off, it's ready to graze. If it comes up out of the ground, the whole plant, the root structure, it's not ready to graze yet. So it's a good quick and dirty kind of method to do that. And then of course our disclaimer, before terminating that cover crop, we want to allow some regrowth. So it's going to take about 2 to 3 days after those livestock have been pulled off in order to terminate that. All right, that is my part.
Great. Let's thank Erika. We have time for a question or two. I know I learned something new, the pluck test. So I know.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great.
So are there any questions either online or in the room?
Yeah, did you see a difference on the compaction depending on how long they were? I mean, I'm assuming that's obvious, but is it enough to say don't allow them to graze as long, or?
Good question.
If you want to repeat the question,
Okay,
just
yes.
for those online.
So our question was there correlation to the length of the grazing season and the compaction? In general, I would say yes, we would expect a little bit more. And one of the fields that we had the biggest issue with compaction was they had to go back to the pasture to get water. So of course, around that gateway, it did get very compacted from there. In general, across the fields, no, I don't think we saw it, but in areas of congregation, feed, water resource, mineral tub, those areas we did see more. Good question.
All right, if not, let's thank Erika again.
Thank you.
Right, and see if I can get off here. We're gonna now hear from Dr. Alison Robertson that is in, I'm gonna let her say what department because I can't, I'm not sure I could, no, here, I'll read it. No, she doesn't have it on there. Oh my gosh. Okay, because her department has a new name, but Alison is a professor and extension field crops pathologist. Let's see here. There we go. She's going to talk to us about solving the mystery, reduced corn yields following a cereal rye cover crop. So Alison, all yours.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I'm in the Department of Plant Pathology, Entomology, and Microbiology. It's a little bit of a mouthful. PPEM is a lot easier to say. So thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about the research that we've been doing, thanks to funding from INRC. And what I'm going to be concentrating mostly on is cereal rye, which is the most common cover crop that is grown in Iowa. And the reason why it's such a popular cover crop is because of its establishment in the fall. It survives these awful winters that we have here in Iowa. And then it also produces a lot of biomass in the spring. So how did we get into growing cover crops? And we owe it all to this gentleman here, Tom Casper, whom many of you probably will know. So Tom is now retired from the USDA ARS, but he worked on cover crops for the last 30 odd years. And one of the things that always concerned Tom was why in some fields, in some years, yield of corn was reduced following a cereal rye cover crop compared to no cover crop. And this really perplexed Tom. And there have been lots of reasons that have been proposed for this yield decline or yield drag, if you want to call it that. And so some of the reasons that are being proposed are planting issues. So not having good seed to soil contact, that can result in uneven stands. Low temperatures because of all that cover crop biomass, blanketing the soil and keeping the soil cooler and wetter. Allelopathy has also been implied at causing this yield reduction, and allelopathy will slow the germination of corn and perhaps affect the growth of the corn. And then also nitrogen immobilization is another reason that has been proposed, and that could lead to low vigor of the corn. And so Tom thought about this, and he heard me give a talk about seedling disease, and what he heard me talking about on seedling disease with corn was that it causes uneven stands, slow and uneven emergence, yellow seedlings, weedy plants, and those weedy plants often produce no ears or very small ears, and that will lead to this yield reduction. And so Tom approached me, and he wondered whether seedling disease could be a reason for this yield drag that we see in corn. And so we got together to do some work on this. And the first thing that we did was Tom had a postdoc working with him, Matt Backer, and I had an assistant scientist in my lab, Jyotsna Acharya. And the first thing that they did was they looked at cereal rye to see if cereal rye could be a host for these corn seedling pathogens. And so what they did was they took roots from cereal rye, and they isolated seedling pathogens, Fusarium and Pythium, which are known to cause seedling disease on corn and soybean and many other crops. And they took those isolates that they'd recovered from the cereal rye, and they infected corn with that, and they were able to cause seedling disease on the corn. And so this was evidence that cereal rye was a host for seedling pathogens of corn. So the next question we asked was, could cereal rye be a green bridge for seedling pathogens of corn? And what do I mean by a green bridge? So basically, here we have the cereal rye, right, with the Fusarium and the Pythium and the roots. And what happens is when we terminate that cereal rye, all those pathogens that are in the roots of the cereal rye are then released into the soil. And so we get this increase in the population of those pathogens. If they don't have a host, they will then decrease back to their background levels, right? So if we plant corn while those population levels are high, it's like we're planting corn into a petri dish full of pathogens, right? And we get seedling disease. So that is what we call the green bridge effect, right? The pathogens that are surviving on survive on the rye, and they use those roots of the rye to bridge then onto the roots of the corn and causes disease. So what we thought of is that if we can plant corn after those pathogen populations have now declined back to those background levels, then in theory, we should have nice, healthy corn growing, right? Because we've broken that green bridge, right? There is now no green bridge for those pathogens. And so with funding from the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, the first research that we did was we looked at the effect of termination timing on seedling disease, growth of corn, and also yield of corn. And so this slide here just gives you an idea of the treatments that we used. We had cover crop, cereal rye that was terminated 1 to 2 days after planting, and then cereal rye terminated 3 days before planting, 8 days before planting, 17 to 25 days before planting, and then of course we have a no cereal rye control. So what we found in this research was that if the interval between planting the cereal rye, terminating the cereal rye and planting the corn was less than 10 days, we saw reduced corn emergence, we saw reduced growth and yield of that corn, we saw increased seedling disease, and interestingly, we saw increased incidence of Pythium species, but there was no effect of cereal rye on the Fusarium species. And so what this research told us was, yes, rye is is a green bridge for these seedling pathogens to go to corn. And the seedling pathogens that we're talking about are Pythium species. Fusarium has nothing to do with this seedling disease. So we came up with the following recommendation, that there should be an interval of at least 10 days between terminating that cereal rye and planting that corn. If we have an interval of at least 10 days, we can reduce the negative effects of that cereal rye on the corn. And so we can reduce the risk not only of seedling disease, but of yield drag or reduced yields. But the problem with this, right, is that we have cold, wet springs. Think of the spring that we've just gone through, right? It's been really cold, okay? And so the problem with that is if it's wet, it's hard to get into the fields to terminate the rye. And if it's cold, glyphosate is not going to be effective at terminating that rye. And so what is a farmer to do? Either he can wait until it warms up, spray the rye, and then plant the corn later. That's going to impact, that could impact his yield potential of his corn. Or he can plant the corn and spray the rye at planting or up to a few days later. And this practice is called planting green. And if you're on Twitter or reading a lot of the farm magazines, there's a lot of interest in planting green at the moment. And so Tom and I looked, and Jyotsna, who also worked on the study, looked at this and thought, this is just a recipe for disaster. So leveraging our INRC money, we then approached USDA and got funding from USDA to see whether planting green could increase seedling disease and contribute to this yield drag. And so in this research that we did, and I want to point out that Practical Farmers of Iowa is also there. So in this research, we also had on-farm trials with PFI. And so with this research, the seed treatments we had were no cereal rye, and then we terminated the cereal rye 12 days after planting, 6 days after planting, greater than 14 days before planting. So we shouldn't see any effect of the cereal rye, right? And then we have our 3 days before planting, where we expect to see seedling disease and yield reduction. And you'll see in most of my research, we have 3 days before planting. What we saw was that at V3, the corn was taller in the planting green plots, and that makes sense because that corn is competing with that cereal rye, right? And so it's etiolated and growing taller. That we also saw more severe seedling disease, just as we expected when we planted green, and we've had greater populations of Pythium and in clade B, which is a particular group of Pythium species. So also in both years, the effect on yield, in our no rye control plots, we had the greatest yield, and the lowest yield we always had where we terminated that cover crop 12 days after planting. And so we stand by our recommendation, right? We need to, we should try and wait at least 10 days between terminating that rye and planting that corn so that we can reduce the risk of seedling disease and therefore yield drag. As a result of our research as well, we got invited into this national study where we're looking at the effect, again, of planting green on disease, but also on slugs and insects, weeds, and then corn. And so this study, we're in our 4th year now, 3rd year of field trials, but in yield year 1, we found that seedling disease was most severe in the planting green treatment in 13 of our 16 sites. So that was exciting to me because it meant that it just didn't happen in Iowa in the fields that we use, that this is it's a system problem. And then the other thing that we found was that the yield of the planting green treatment was less than the yield of the early terminated treatment at 6 of the 14 sites. At another 6 of the 14 sites, it was equivalent, and at 2 of the 14 sites, it was actually greater. So I'm looking forward to explaining that one. So I've talked about how we can temporarily separate cereal rye from corn, right? But another way that we can reduce disease risk is by separating the corn and the cereal rye in space. And so this is some research that INRC funded that we fondly call our social distancing experiment. And it was done by a master's student in my lab, Sarah Kurtz. She also received a scholarship from the North Central Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education Center. And in this one, we had a couple of on-farm trials, as well as our small plot trials that we did with the Iowa Soybean Association. And so this gives you an idea of what our treatments are. And all those purple dots that you see there in the cartoons are the Pythium, right? So we have our no-rye control, and then we have corn that was 15 inches away from the rye, corn that was 7.5 inches away from the rye, and then corn that was planted right into the rye, right? The rye was drilled, and so the way that we did this was for the corn space 15 inches from the rye, we plugged 3 of the drills and then planted the cereal rye. So basically the cereal rye was planted on 30-inch rows, right? And then when the corn was planted 7.5 inches from the rye, we plugged 1 of the drills, and that was where the corn was planted. So we had 3 rows of rye in between the 2 rows of corn. And what Sarah found was that by spatially separating the corn from the cereal rye, we got reduced seedling disease, reduced numbers of Pythium in the rhizosphere and also in the radicle of the corn. We had increased corn vigor. And also, when that corn was 15 inches away from that cereal rye, we had similar yields to the no rye. But there's a shortfall with this experiment, right? Because if we're only planting a row of cereal rye every 30 inches, we have 75% less cover on the land, right? If we're planting those 3 rows of rye in between the 2 rows of corn, then we have 25% less cover. And so what does this mean for soil erosion, for soil health, and then also for nutrient recycling? And so last year, we got funding from the INRC to start a project, and our co-PI on this is Peter O'Brien from USDA ARS. And so the question that we're asking here is, can we socially distance the cereal rye and plant green to mitigate the reduction in corn yields and seedling disease, and still provide all the agro-ecosystem services that that cover crop provides? And so we planted our cereal rye last year. I don't have any data to show you. Obviously, the season's just started, but we're really excited about that research. But it's not as simple as seedling disease, right? We have dozens of questions. So if you think about disease, cereal rye, and therefore causing seedling disease. So some of the things that we're curious about are cereal rye biomass, allelopathy, and nitrogen immobilization. So as regards cereal rye biomass, this is some data from on the left-hand side is data from one of our projects that was funded by INRC, where you can see that as rye biomass increases, yield decreases. And then on the right, you can see data there from Tom Casper showing you exactly the same thing. The more biomass we have, we seem to get more yield drag. So we just finished this project a couple of years ago. There were a lot of faculty from across CALS who were involved in this. And this is a publication that recently came out. But what we found was that cereal rye biomass in the spring depended on fall establishment. We had more biomass in the broadcast versus the drilled, and that was basically just because we broadcast the cereal rye into a standing soybean crop versus drilling after the soybean crop was harvested. And so we actually drilled a little bit late. But the corn growth and yield were negatively related to that spring biomass, and we had more seedling disease in the broadcast rye. Why? because we have more biomass. So how is biomass affecting seedling disease as well as this yield drag? And just within the last couple of weeks, we heard that we got funding from USDA NIFA. And so Mark Lecht and Marsha McDaniel and Peter O'Brien and I will be looking at the role of biomass on corn growth, seedling disease, and soil health, nutrient recycling, and a ton of other things. So, but we were able to leverage this research to help with that. Giotsna was very interested in allelopathy, and so we got funding from INRC to look at that. What she found was that when we have allelochemicals are present, we have more severe seedling disease. And in her most recent publication that came out this past month, she was able to show that seedling disease varied among cereal rye cultivars. This research was done in the lab, but we suspect that it has something to do with biomass, because cereal rye varieties will vary in the amount of biomass they produce, but also they're going to vary in the quality and quantity of the allelochemicals they produce. So how perhaps by doing this research or investigating this, we can come up with cereal rye varieties to recommend to farmers ahead of corn. Lastly, we are looking at nitrogen immobilization. So another INRC funded project with Mark Lecht and Marsha McDaniel and Peter O'Brien, my partners in crime. And this, we're looking at the role of how nitrogen affects. So nitrogen cycling and soil health, but also we're looking at seedling disease. And the theory here is that as that cereal rye is breaking down, we're immobilizing nitrogen in the soil. That means there's no nitrate available for that germinating, developing corn seedling. It's stressed and it's more susceptible to seedling disease. So I want to say thank you, a big thank you for coming today, and thank you to those of you who are online. I also want to say a big thank you to Tom Casper and Keith Kohler, who twisted my arm, which is now very rubber, into working on cover crops. It's been an awesome journey, and I look forward to exciting things to come. In the next, Giotsna is in the blue jacket, and next to her is Sarah Kurtz, the master's student. So Giotsna and Sarah did all this work. So a big thank you to them. I want to say thank you to Stefan there in the white shirt and the cap, who has been just an awesome person to brainstorm with about what cover crops are doing to corn. And then in the last picture there in the purple jacket and the big hat is Rochelle and Clarice, both from my lab. I want to thank them for criticizing this presentation before I presented it to you today. So it's a little bit sharper than it could have been. And Giotsna has since left, and so Rochelle will be carrying on with her work. But thank you very much for coming today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks. Alison, I'm going to take my prerogative as a moderator to ask the first question. Okay, so for the, you saw when you planted green, there was a yield hit.
Yes.
Okay, so what would, for the one where you planted 17 to 25 days late, was that did you delay? So say, for example, we had a year when you couldn't get that killed very early and you had to wait 17 to 25 days, so that we ended up delaying the corn planting beyond the optimal, so that corn planting was actually after if we planted it green. Do you think the yields might be like?
So the 17 to 24 days is before planting the corn, right?
Yeah.
So the reason why there's a range there is because, that's like 3 weeks before we plant. So we plant, the corn's all planted on the same day.
That's what I was wondering. Okay, yes. For this study, it's all planted on the same day.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then in the planting green study, where we terminated 6 days after and 12 days after planting, again, the corn's all planted on the same day.
Okay.
But there's a little bit of wiggle room in those numbers, just because You don't know what the weather's gonna do, right?
So then you're waiting to plant essentially everything until the 17 to 25 days after
Yes.
tilling.
Yeah, so we always aim to plant the first
Yeah.
week of May.
Okay,
And so then we work backwards and say, okay, if we're planting the first week of May, then we want to terminate by April the 10th.
okay,
So,
okay.
yeah, and then we
Yeah.
just, and sometimes it gets delayed till the middle of May,
Yeah.
right?
I'm somewhat wondering if we planted green in like the third week of April,
Yes,
would we, what,
I
would there
think,
be enough difference in that planting date that we're planting earlier in the planting green situation that we might overcome any of that other yield drag?
I think we'd have more seedling disease because we're cooler and wetter.
Okay,
And Pittsburgh
great.
likes cool and wet.
Okay.
So
okay,
that's
it
what I
might
think,
even-
but
yeah.
that's a
Okay,
great question.
okay.
Yeah,
All right,
good idea.
other questions? No? Okay. Is there, oh, yeah, and, yeah, okay, we can, our communications, yeah.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. Very interesting and lots of good information about cereal rye, which obviously has some issues before corn. So at some point, maybe this will encourage us to think more about other cover crops, which I know, yeah, they, all have their issues, but, it sort of points to maybe some of the benefits of other cover
Yes.
crops.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So there's a problem with cereal rye before corn. But at the moment, we don't have a lot of choice of cover crops that we can plant before corn. We did do an INRC study where we used camelina and cereal rye ahead of corn and ahead of soybeans. And camelina was definitely better ahead of corn than cereal rye, but we still had a little bit of a yield drag from the camelina. I have some collaborators at Nebraska, and as the student there has just finished research with hairy vetch ahead of corn, and she saw no yield impact. And the one thing that I'm really interested in is it balsa clover or something like that? And they're doing a lot of work in Illinois and Indiana on that. And I really think that would be interesting. But yeah, there are issues if you plant cereal rye ahead of corn. But we can avoid them if we separate, leave longer gaps, decrease the amount of biomass maybe. So
In Nebraska, they might be able to get the hairy vetch to overwinter. We'd struggle to
Yes.
get it to overwinter
yeah,
consistently, probably.
Yeah,
So,
and
yeah.
we tried hairy vetch one year with
Yeah.
Tom, and we never got it
That's
to
what we
overwinter.
we tried it with the learning farms, and they were separated like a couple little sprigs that overwintered, I think, so. All right,
So we know.
yeah, one more, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your talk. It happened also with you pair cereal rye with soybean. Something like
No.
that.
So
It's
the
great
question
question.
was whether we see the similar problems with cereal rye with soybean following it, yeah.
And that's a great question. And cereal rye ahead of corn and soybean. And you don't see anything with soybean. And which is just fascinating because the seedling pathogens that affect corn also affect soybean. And yet we don't have a problem with soybean. So I don't know what it is.
Even when planting green.
Even when planting green,
Yeah.
you can plant green with soybeans and they do fine. I mean, soybeans are so resilient and corn is such a princess.
Okay, and then that, in the meeting.